Are Muslims extremists? We're going to address the claims that Muslims are extremists, but before we get started looking at the research on this topic, I need to acknowledge that extremism is very difficult to define. In a lot of cases, extremism is basically in the eye of the beholder. So, for example, here in the United States on the abortion debate, people on both sides of the debate call each other extremists. People who are on the pro-life side say that the pro-choice side are extremists who are murdering babies. On the other side, people who are on the pro-choice side, they say that the pro-life side are extremists who don't care about the health of women. So before we can answer the question, are Muslims extremists, we have to actually decide, what do we mean by extremism? Who are we going to define as extremists? What I'm doing in this video is not trying to define extremism for myself or for you. Instead, what I'm going to do is look at research literature on this topic. How do social scientists answer the question, are Muslims extremists? Lots of different social scientists have looked at this question, and they have defined extremism in different ways. So I'm going to be showing you how different social scientists have tackled this question, how they have defined it, and you can make up your own mind about whether you think that those definitions of extremism are good definitions or not, whether you agree with those definitions or not. I've broken this research down into some main categories. First, we're going to look at Muslims and democracy. Next, we're going to look at Muslims and gender and sex, Muslim values associated with gender and sex. Third, we're going to look specifically at Islam and terrorism. And fourth, we're just going to talk about how conservatism is not the same thing as extremism. First, let's look at the research on Islam and democracy. There have been some researchers who have claimed that Islam is counter to democracy, that it is somehow anti-democratic, and that Muslims can't really be good Muslims and be in favor of democracy. And this is one of the major arguments people make when they're talking about whether or not Muslims are extremists. The most famous iteration of this idea came from 1993. This was Sam Huntington's very famous article, Clash of Civilizations. In this article, Sam Huntington claimed that there's the Western world that has pro-democratic values, and then there's the Muslim world that is anti-democratic. He claimed that this was a major clash between these two world civilizations, that Islam is always going to be anti-democracy. Although Sam Huntington's article became extremely famous after he wrote it, in reality it wasn't really based on a lot of evidence. It was mostly just Samuel Huntington sitting around and theorizing about how he thought the world was. So after his article came out, there were lots of social scientists who tried to actually test this theory. How democratic are Muslims versus non-Muslims? There have been lots of different ways of testing this theory, lots of different surveys, lots of different ways of measuring democracy around the world. But one of the easiest ways to do it is just look at Muslim countries, and you'll discover that Muslim countries tend to be less democratic on average than non-Muslim countries. However, if you compare Arab Muslim countries versus non-Arab Muslim countries, so you have Arab Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Syria, and then you have non-Arab Muslim countries that are in completely different parts of the world, like Bangladesh. So if you're comparing those two different groups, what you actually discover is that non-Arab Muslim countries have way more democracy than anybody would predict, considering how poor they tend to be. In fact, Non-Arab Muslim countries are considered democratic overachievers because they are about 20 times more likely to be democratic than the Arab Muslim countries. So what we're seeing here is actually a difference between Arab countries and non-Arab countries in terms of how democratic they are. It isn't really a difference between Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So then social scientists ask the next question, which is, okay, so Arab Muslim countries do tend to have less democracy, but is that actually what their people want? After all, lots of people live under governments that don't actually reflect what they personally want. So it may be that lots of people in Arab Muslim countries are democratic. It's just that their government doesn't reflect what they actually wish their government was. Researchers have tackled this question in lots of different surveys, lots of different research papers. I'll give you some of the data here. Using the World Values Survey from the years 2000 to 2002, researchers studied Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and Jordan. They asked people a variety of questions about how they felt about democracy, and then they also separately asked people a variety of questions about their religiousness. They theorized that if Samuel Huntington was right, that Islam prevents people from being democratic, then the more religious people are, the less democratic those people should be. Instead, what they found was that religiousness had no relationship at all with democratic feelings. For example, how often people attended mosque or how much they participated in religious activities had no relationship whatsoever to how they answered questions about democracy. Other research from the Pan-Arab Research Center surveyed people from 2001 to 2003, and they compared value systems. They looked at people in Egypt, Iran, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and they compared people's answers in those countries to the United States. They asked, who agrees with this statement? Democracy is the best form of government. What they found was 69% of people in Iran said yes, 71% of people in Saudi Arabia, 88% of people in the United States, 90% of people in Jordan, and 99% of people in Egypt. So they weren't actually finding that the people in these majority Muslim countries were any different than people in the United States. Here's an interesting measurement. This was asking people how much they supported a rule by strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. In other words, a dictator. How much would you support a dictator? So instead of asking people how much they support democracy, you can flip the question around and say, well, how much do you support a dictator? I'm going to put a whole bunch of countries and their percentage support for dictatorship on the screen here, but what you're going to see is that there really isn't any relationship between being Muslim and supporting dictatorships. You can see that some countries that have strong support for dictatorships are Muslim and some others are Christian. Other countries that have very weak support for dictatorships are Muslim. Other countries that have very weak support for dictatorships are Christian. There really isn't a strong relationship between the religion that is the majority in the country and how people feel about dictatorship. There's a lot more data in these papers showing support for democracy and support for authoritarianism and support for dictatorship. I'm not going to go into all these numbers, but you can see just from these few examples that there just is not data to support Samuel Huntington's idea that somehow Muslims are anti-democratic. Okay, he can say that all he wants to, but there's no evidence to support it at all. If you identify anti-democratic ideas with extremism, by that measure, then you would have to say that Islam is not extremist. After researchers tried to test Samuel Huntington's theory that maybe Muslims are anti-democratic, and it turned out there was just no evidence at all that he was correct, then some researchers changed the goalpost. They said, well, maybe Muslims aren't more anti-democratic. That isn't what makes them extremists. Instead, it's Muslims' views on women and sex. That's what makes Muslims extremist. And some went so far as to even claim that that made them anti-democratic. It doesn't matter if they actually love democracy. If you aren't going to treat women well, then you're not democratic. Two of the biggest names in this line of thinking are Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris. Inglehart and Norris claim that the real difference between Muslim societies and Western societies, by which they mean Christian societies, is gender equality, not democracy. Inglehart and Norris use their World Values Survey to look at Muslims' attitudes on issues like women's rights, gay rights, divorce, abortion, things like that, and argued that Muslims are generally intolerant despite their support for democracy. And I will say there is evidence that Muslims in general are less tolerant of women's rights than non-Muslims in general. We're just talking about general trends here. Of course, anything humans can do, somebody somewhere is doing. So there are definitely non-Muslims who are intolerant of women's rights, and there are definitely Muslims who are very tolerant of women's rights. But looking at global average scores to survey questions about women's rights, you do see that Muslims tend to be more conservative on these issues. If you define extremism in this way, then yeah, you could make a case that Muslims are more extremist than other groups. This research has been repeated in lots of different places and found that this even applies to immigrants. Muslim immigrants into Western countries tend to be as democratic or more democratic than the countries that they are immigrating to, but they do tend to be a lot more conservative on these issues of women's rights, gay rights, abortion, divorce, etc. Some researchers argue that this relationship between Islam and women's rights makes Muslims undemocratic. So even though it's pretty clear from survey data that Muslims are not actually anti-democratic, these researchers claim, it doesn't matter what Muslims say about how they feel about democracy, we're going to accuse them of being undemocratic anyway, just because of their views on women's rights. Researchers tested this theory. What is the actual relationship between democratic values and values concerning women's rights? What the researchers found was that in non-Arab Muslim countries, again, we're seeing this difference between Muslim countries that are Arab and Muslim countries that are not Arab. But in non-Arab Muslim countries, the higher support for women's rights go, the higher support for democracy goes. So in non-Arab Muslim countries, those two actually are linked. They rise and fall together. However, the researchers found that in Arab Muslim countries, the relationship was the opposite. The more people supported women's rights, the less likely they were to support democracy, and vice versa. When the researchers asked why would this relationship exist in Arab Muslim countries, what they found is that often it is a dictator who is protecting women's rights in those countries. So of course, if your dictator is protecting women's rights, you would see democracy as a step backwards for women's rights, if that was your particular situation. Overall, what they found is that the relationship between democracy and women's rights is very complex, and it changes from one country to another. You can't just look at one country and see how it operates and then assume that you understand everything you need to know about the Muslim world. Instead, it varies so much country by country that in fact, they argue that Sam Huntington's idea of a clash of civilizations isn't really true. It's not that there's a clash between the Western world and the Muslim world. Instead, they argue the true clash is Muslims on this side and Muslims on that side. One point researchers emphasize is the fact that a lot of times Westerners will make all these assumptions about why Muslims are doing what they're doing without actually examining the true reasons behind it. For example, there are a lot of Western countries, France most notably, who have banned veiling by Muslim women wearing a hijab or a burqa or any of the other kinds of veils that Muslim women wear. And usually, when these countries give their reasons for why they're banning Muslim veils, they will claim that women are forced to wear these veils against their will, and this is a sign of extreme gender ideologies and gender imbalances. The actual data on women veiling doesn't support this. Yes, it absolutely is true that there are some places in the world where women are required to wear a veil even though they wouldn't want to. But it's not true that that is happening all over the world, or that every woman you would ever see wearing a Muslim veil is being forced to. For example, there's some really interesting research out of Austin, Texas, where researchers interviewed Muslim women who veiled. Not a single one of them was being forced to veil. In fact, in a lot of cases, they were veiling despite what their family and friends might want them to do. And for them, they reported that wearing the veil is kind of like a Christian wearing a cross necklace or having a cross tattoo. It's just a symbol of your faith. It wasn't about being oppressed. It wasn't about being forced to do anything. And it wasn't about any kind of creepy gender ideas or sexism. It's just a symbol of faith. So a lot of the research says that Westerners shouldn't be so quick to assume that all Muslims believe in gender inequality or in oppressing women. That's just not true. And a lot of the signs that Westerners point to as evidence of gender oppression could be or they could not be. Then you have a whole other line of research that I'm not going to get into in a lot of detail, but probably the most famous paper from this is Candioti's 1988 article, Bargaining with Patriarchy, where Candioti describes how there is a band of patriarchy that goes across the globe from North Africa into Turkey and Pakistan and Iran, and then on into India and China. This band cuts across a lot of different religious groups, including Hinduism, Confucianism, and Islam. Candioti argues in this article that patriarchy really is a long-standing cultural tradition in this area of the world, that because it cuts across so many different religions, it's really not about religion at all. Instead, it's about a cultural heritage of patriarchy. And religion is almost like the wrapping paper that's papered over the thing inside, which is the long-standing cultural tradition of patriarchy. So people might use the religion to paper over this tradition and say, oh yeah, that's why we do it, that's why we do it. But in reality, the evidence is that it is a thousands of year old cultural tradition. Now let's look at terrorism. When we're asking the question, are Muslims extremists? One of the biggest questions that we have to answer is, are Muslims more likely to be terrorists than other groups of people? In fact, especially in the United States, a lot of people almost think of the word terrorist and the word Muslim as the same thing, as though they are literally the same thing. But evidence suggests that that viewpoint isn't correct. For example, Europol surveyed all terrorist acts committed between 2009 and 2013 and found that less than 2% of them were religiously motivated. So most terrorism in Europe has nothing at all to do with religion, much less Muslim extremists. The FBI surveying terrorist activity in the United States found similar results. They surveyed all terrorist attacks from 1980 to 2005 and found that only 6% of them were ever committed by Muslims. 94% of them were committed by people who weren't Muslim. In another study of U.S. terrorism, this one looked at terrorist attacks from 2008 to 2016 and found that domestic terrorists, non-Muslim, committed double the amount of terrorist attacks than Muslims did. And yet another study, which looked from 2011 to 2016 in the United States, found that only 12% of terrorist attacks in the United States were committed by Muslims, which was half the number that was committed by other groups such as white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other far-right groups. So no matter how you slice this data, whether you're looking at Europol data, FBI data, or some other study, it is simply not true that most terrorist attacks are committed by Muslims. So why do people, especially in the United States, have the false idea that most terrorists are Muslims and that most Muslims are terrorists? Well, media. Media has given people that perspective. Muslim terrorist attacks receive 450% more media coverage than other terrorist attacks. In the New York Times and the Washington Post between 2002 and 2015, failed Muslim terrorist activities received 770% more media coverage than non-Muslims committing similar activities. And other research has shown that over a 25-year period, Muslims have gotten more negative headlines in the New York Times than cocaine, cancer, or alcohol. If you have the perception that terrorism is linked with Islam, that's because the media wants you to have that perception. One researcher compared religious extremism within Christianity to religious extremism within Islam and found that they were virtually identical in every way. Their methods of terrorism were the same. They use violence to try and accomplish their goals. They most often have male perpetrators. They focus on violence against individuals. They try to maximize the fatalities. They focus on bombings and mass shootings, lone wolf attacks that are not committed as part of a larger organization or on the rise in both cases, and people are being radicalized on the internet in both cases. When the researcher compared Christian extremism and Muslim extremism in their ideologies, the researcher found virtually identical ideologies. Religion is the driving force, whether that religion is Christian or Muslim. They both have a clash of civilizations discourse, this idea that there is Muslim civilization and then there's Christian civilization, and the two of them are going to go to war at some point. They both use religion to justify and explain their actions, such as a Christian who bombs an abortion clinic. Both foresee an apocalyptic battle between each other. Both see their culture as threatened by the other. And interestingly, both of these groups lack basic religious education, not only about the other group, but about their own group. Research has found that both Christian extremists and Muslim extremists get basic tenets of their own faith completely wrong. They don't know their own faith very well. They're just using their faith as an excuse to commit the terrorism that they already wanted to commit. Then the researcher compared extremist Christianity to extremist Islam on the terrorist personal feelings. Both of these groups are full of people who feel disempowered, they feel isolated, alienated, and they lack economic opportunity, or they find themselves in difficult economic circumstances. So what we're seeing is extremist Islam and extremist Christianity are mirror images of each other. They are so similar. They aren't even cousins. They're like siblings of each other. So there's this completely wrong idea out there that Islam is somehow uniquely suited to creating terrorists in this world, when that's not true. Extremist Christianity or extremist Islam can both create terrorism, and both of them create extremely similar terrorism at that. It's just extremist ideology that's dangerous. It's not Islam in particular. There are some people who claim that Islam supports all kinds of violence, not just terrorism. I'm lumping this point in with the larger point about terrorism, but here we're talking about whether or not Islam supports violence in general. For example, in 2014, Bill Maher claimed that Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas, and he quoted a Pew Research Center poll that showed that 90% of Egyptian Muslims supported death as a punishment for leaving the faith. I found researchers who investigated this idea as well, and here's what they found. There was a ton of country by country variation. What Bill Maher said about Egypt absolutely is true. Egypt is a majority Muslim country, and it is true that 90% of Egyptian Muslims said that they supported death for people who leave the faith. What Bill Maher left out, though, is that, for example, in Kazakhstan, only 0.8% of Muslims would agree with that idea. Researchers have actually found that there is a tremendous amount of country by country variation among Muslim countries. So you can't just take one country and say, aha, this is how Muslims are. Researchers looked specifically at this question that Bill Maher had brought up. They looked at Muslim support for killing apostates, for stoning adulterers, and severe punishment for thieves, such as cutting off hands. What they found was extreme variation from one Muslim country to another, but what did predict whether people in that country were going to be more extremist or not was development. The greater development in a country, the less likely they were to support this kind of violence extremism. So what we're actually seeing here is a difference between richer Muslims and poorer Muslims. We aren't actually seeing a problem with Islam, we're seeing a problem with poverty. They also found that generally the more educated people are, the less supportive they are of violence. So it really isn't true to say all Muslims support, stoning adulterers. Instead, it's accurate to say poorer people and less educated people support stoning adulterers. What the researchers found in conclusion was that while Bill Maher is technically accurate, he was cherry picking the absolute worst example he could find and then claiming that was all Muslims, whereas that's really not true. Now let's talk about how conservatism and extremism are conflated. A lot of the people who make these arguments will basically show that Muslims are conservative, and then they'll say, see, I told you how extremist they are. But being conservative and being extremist are two different things. They should not be considered the same thing. For an example of how these two things are often conflated, there was a Muslim preacher who was super popular who was invited to speak in Singapore, and the Singapore government declared that he was not welcome in their country because he was too extremist. Once the Singapore Minister for Home Affairs and Law had made a public statement, it turned out the thing that they had objected to was that this preacher said that Muslims should not tell Christians Merry Christmas. That was it. In every other way, this Muslim preacher was extremely tolerant. He specifically said that Christians should be encouraged to celebrate their holidays and that Muslims should be encouraged to celebrate their holidays. He said that everyone should live in peace and should serve God according to their own consciences. He was simply encouraging his congregation to not say Merry Christmas to Christians. The Singapore government labeled this as hatred. I think that's a perfect example of how someone can be conservative. Yes, he's saying, I don't want to say Merry Christmas to Christians because I don't believe in Christmas, but that ends up being conflated with extremism. He was conflated with being a terrorist. There is no definition of terrorism that includes the idea of not saying Merry Christmas to Christians. That's just not terrorism. Terrorism is a violent act in which usually people die. This preacher definitely is conservative, but is he an extremist terrorist? No, not really by any reasonable definition. Conservative Muslims are those that accept the authority of Muslim holy texts and follow traditional religious authorities. You might notice that this is very similar to the definition of conservative Christians. Most people would say that conservative Christians are those that try to follow the authority of Christian holy texts and follow traditional religious authorities within Christianity. In contrast, extremist Muslims are those that practice bigotry, intolerance toward others, and specifically trying to coerce or force others into accepting your opinions. For example, a Muslim who prays 5 times a day according to their holy teachings may be conservative. However, a Muslim who tries to force other people to pray 5 times a day, that's an extremist. The difference is in how you behave yourself in your own private life versus whether you're trying to force that on other people. Just having conservative views doesn't make you an extremist. Not all conservatives are extremists. For example, conservative Muslims mostly reject terrorism and are known to combat terrorism all over the world. And on the other hand, not all extremists are conservative. For example, in 2015, in November in Paris, there were terrorist attacks that were perpetrated by liberal Muslims. These were Muslims who drank alcohol and went clubbing. So conservatism is not the same as extremism or terrorism. Interestingly, I was able to find one survey that compared British Muslims to other British people, and it found that on average, British Muslims are a lot more conservative than other British people about all kinds of issues like gender, sex, abortion, and homosexuality. When the survey researchers compared British Muslims to British Christians only, not all British people, but just British Christians, what they found was that conservative British Muslims were extremely similar in their viewpoints to conservative Christians in Britain. So what's actually going on here is religious conservatism. It's not that Muslims are so different, it's that they're exactly like all other religious conservatives. Let's sum up what we've learned here. When we ask the question, are Muslims extremists? Here are some of the different ways that researchers have tackled this question and the answers they've come up with. One way is to look at how democratic Muslims are, and all the research that I could find said that Muslims are just as democratic, if not more democratic, than Westerners. So by that measure, Muslims cannot be called extremists. Next, some researchers ask questions about gender and sexuality, such as gender roles, homosexuality, divorce, and abortion, and they claim that if you have too conservative of views on these issues, then you must be an extremist. We have seen that it is true that Muslims around the world tend to have more conservative views on these issues than other people do. If you're going to use this line of argument to say that Muslims are extremists, be aware of the fact that Muslims are not any more or less conservative on average than conservative Christians. So if you're going to call Muslims extremists on the basis of their views of gender and sexuality, then you're also going to have to call conservative Christians extremists as well. Next, we looked at terrorism. We saw that Muslims are not any more likely to be terrorists or to be violent than anybody else. In fact, in Western countries, terrorism is much more likely to be committed by non-Muslims than it is to be committed by Muslims. And media is just flat out lying to you when they try to convince you that all Muslims are terrorists or that all terrorists are Muslims. Both of those statements are false. And finally, we tackled the issue of how the word conservative is very often taken to mean the same thing as extremist, even though those two words have two different meanings and shouldn't be considered the same thing. Anybody who stops to think about the terms is probably going to decide that not all conservatives are extremists, but people use this language in a sloppy way, and they throw around terms like conservative and extremist, interchanging them for each other, and it creates the illusion that Muslims are all extremists. So, are Muslims extremists? It's really up to you. If you think that people who have conservative views on gender roles, homosexuality, abortion, and divorce are extremists, well, then, yeah, you could claim that Muslims are extremists. If you don't think that those viewpoints necessarily make someone an extremist, well, then you would have to say that the evidence supports the idea that Muslims are not extremists.